Welcome, everyone. My name is Edward Herson. I'm a broker with Brown Harris Stevens in New York City, and this is BHS Broker Daily. So, I'm your host, and in this series, I'll take a deep dive behind the scenes of a typical New York City transaction, the life of a New York City real estate broker, and I'll be bringing in my team of experts that work so hard to make a typical New York City transaction so easy. So today, my guest is real estate attorney Ira Gold. I've worked with Ira on many transactions. Welcome, Ira.
Hi, Ed. Nice to be
Hey,
here.
Ira. Thank you. So, hey, Ira, why don't you give us a little history of your experience and we'll just jump right in.
Sure. So, I am a residential real estate lawyer. It's exclusively what I do. I practice in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, representing both buyers and sellers of co ops, condos, townhomes, and single family homes.
Sounds great, Ira, and it's been a pleasure to work with you. My background, I got licensed in 1996 with BHS, and I've been selling residential real estate ever since. So let's dive right in. Since this is our first session, I thought we would just start at the very beginning. So, what's the first thing that happens when a buyer calls you? I've worked with them. We've identified a property. I've given them a little bit of background of how it's going to work and told them that they need a New York City real estate broker. I turn them over. They call you. What happens at that point, Ira?
Sure, good question, Ed. So usually a buyer will call me. They will say, "Hey, Ed Herson referred you. I'm looking to buy," and they'll tell me what they're looking to buy. And let's assume it's a co-op. I'll then ask them several questions concerning the co-op, the address, who, if anyone, they're buying with, whether they're financing, when they would like to close, pertinent details so that I have an idea that will allow me to walk them through the process that they would be involved with if they decided to retain me.
Great. So usually what happens, always what happens, is that we're the first contact. We have all the information about what a buyer or a seller wants. And what we do as brokers is we put together what's called a deal summary. So with this deal summary, it layouts all of the basic elements of a contract. So what do you look for in a deal summary? And what are some of the things that you've seen in a deal summary that may stand out to you?
So a deal summary, as Ed just stated, will give me who the seller is, who the seller's attorney is, the purchase price. Sometimes it'll go into further granular detail. How many shares of stock, again, if it's a co op, whether there's a flip tax, the amount of financing that's involved. I'll look for exclusions for furnishings or special inclusions, or really anything that might be unique to the deal.
Right. Yep. The deal summary is super important because, especially with exclusions and inclusions, because if they're not in there and they're not mentioned in the contract, when you go through the walkthrough, and let's say the chandelier is not in the living room and the buyer thought it would be there, it causes a big problem. So
Correct.
I've had that happen before, and we try to get around that. So it's always good to really talk about that deal summary to make sure that the elements of the contract are there for you, so that you can discuss that with your buyer. So what happens after that? So we've identified the property, they've called you, and they do what? They retain you. How does that work?
Well, so I will explain to them when they're buying, let's again use a co-op. I know that the buyer likes the apartment that Ed has shown them, and they want to buy it. But what the buyer really doesn't know, and is really what the real estate lawyer does, and it's critical, is what's going on in the co-op. Is the building being run properly from a property management point of view and from a financial point of view? And without that information, no buyer should ever sign a contract. So that's really, the most important part.
Right. So that's due diligence.
Correct.
Okay, so in the due diligence process, I take the buyer as far as I can. And I tell them that there'll be a board package. If there's in a condo as well, there's board packages. And over the years, they've become to look more and more and more like co-op board packages. But in a co-op, of
Sure.
course, there's an interview. So I'll prepare them as much as possible. But what are some of the things that you do that I can't do as far as
Sure.
due diligence goes?
So I will read the co-op's offering plan. That's usually a voluminous book that is put out when the building first becomes a co-op in Manhattan and Brooklyn. It's 30 or 40 years old sometimes, but it
Hmm.
does contain some information that's going to be helpful. I'm going to read the audited financial statements to
Hmm.
make sure that that building is financially doing well. Most importantly, I'm going to read the co-op's board minutes so
Hmm.
that I can get an understanding of what the board of directors of the co-op are concerned about and thinking about. Um, as a follow-up to that, though, sometimes board minutes are fairly opaque. Having done this for 30 years, I can read between the lines pretty well, but in almost all cases, I'm going to follow up with what's known as a co-op questionnaire that's drafted by me with very specific questions based on everything I've read and discussed with both Ed and the client so that I can get the property manager on record for the most part with information that I feel a buyer should have before they sign a contract. All due diligence occurs before they sign a contract, before they commit the down payment deposit.
Right. That's great to know. So with board minutes, of course, brokers don't have access to those. Especially pre-COVID, you had to make an appointment and actually go down most times to the managing agent, right? You'd have to make an appointment, Ira.
Pre-COVID, you would have to make an appointment and definitely go wherever the management company was.
Right. You sit
Po-
in a locked vault. They lock
yeah,
you in there. No cameras, no recording devices.
yeah,
So,
for sure. They and
right?
these places don't love attorneys coming in and looking at things. So yeah, they
Right.
they shut you off in a small room.
That's right.
Uh, Post COVID, frequently management companies will email the minutes, not always, but
Right.
so it's done both. Either way, it's a step that really has to occur because I want to be able to tell a buyer before they're committing their 10% that either the co op is great, no problems, or listen, the co op's a disaster, run for the hills. You don't want to buy this thing. Or more likely, and in 95% of the cases, I'm going to say, look, this is what I found. This is my opinion of what I found. Now you decide. You tell me what you think, and we'll go through a process because my goal is to have a buyer feel as comfortable as possible for, what is probably the biggest transaction of their life.
Right.
So it's critical.
Exactly. So why is it so important for a buyer or a seller to hire a New York City experienced attorney? In other parts of the country, there's a different scenario where I've seen people close deals with the title company. But why is it so important in New York City to have someone that's experienced with co-ops and condos?
So, and that's a great question. So in New York City, where the majority of the housing stock are co-ops. That's a very unique form of ownership. That is not a common way if you go outside of Manhattan or really outside of the city. You don't find a lot of co-ops. So you need an attorney, whether it's me or whoever is representing you, to really understand how co-ops work, what the form of ownership is all about, outside of New York City, by custom and usage, sometimes lawyers don't get involved. In the New York City area and the surrounding counties, almost 99.9, there should be a lawyer.
Right.
You would be in trouble without one.
Exactly. And another thing that I thought about in your due diligence process is what if there's like a violation in the building or in the apartment that no one knows about, and they go in, they sign a contract, they own it, they move in, and all of a sudden they get a letter from the DOB. How do you protect people? How do we protect people against violations? What do you do there, Ira?
Sure. So as part and that's really important. So as part of the due diligence process, I am going to go on the various New York City Department of Building websites, scour those websites to look for open permits, or if somebody's buying combined units, you want to make sure that that combination occurred legally. And it's fairly common sometimes, that these open permits appear, and it may not even be the seller that you're buying it from did the work. It could be an earlier person who did the work and the contractor never closed out the permit. Well, if you buy that apartment without handling that situation properly, that now becomes your problem. So I handle that before the contract, but also put language in the contract so that my client would not have to close until that permit is properly closed out.
Right, right. So the scenario is I'll walk into an apartment with a buyer. They'll say it's great. They'll call you. You'll start doing all of your work. You'll talk to them on the phone about how it works. You'll get the deal summary from me on the elements of the contract. You'll see the contract. I would suppose you'll start negotiating and talking to the other side about the fine elements of the contract to make sure that all the language is good for both sides. Then you'll read the minutes from the board, you'll read the offering plan, you'll read the financial statements, you'll see that everything is a go or a no go. How long does this process take?
So that process can take anywhere from a week to a couple of weeks, in part because the attorney is dependent on the management company to give the information that the attorney is going to need to make the evaluation. And management companies are busy. The last thing they want to do is put answers in writing to lawyers about things. So it can become a process that takes a couple of weeks. I try to do it as quickly as possible because I know that transactions kind of have a life of their own, and you want to get to contract. But I tell my clients never to rush. You need to have the answers before you put your money down and you sign the contract.
Right, right. That's very important. So, of course, the contract deposit goes into escrow and that's held. But one of the things that we'll talk about in one of our next episodes with you is what happens with all of the different timings between when their financing runs out, how long it takes to get a board interview, what happens with the commitment letter, and how that all ties together. And I know you're an expert at that. So I guess after all this is done, you'll have a conversation with your buyer and say it's a go or it's a no. And then they will then sign the contract,
Right.
send it over to the other side. And what
No,
I'm told,
they'll send it to me,
send it to you, right? Thank
right?
you. And I'm told that it's not a done deal until it's signed, sealed, and delivered to the other side, to the seller side.
Right. So it's not actually a binding contract. Once the buyer is moving ahead, they'll send me the contract. I'll review it one last time to make sure everything is as it should be. I'll send it to the seller's attorney. I will then instruct the buyer to wire the deposit, almost always 10% of the purchase price, to the seller's attorney's escrow account. Once that money is received by the seller's attorney and the seller signs off on the contract and the seller's attorney signs off as escrow agent and returns it to me, that's the moment there's a fully executed contract. And that starts the timer on all the important things that you just mentioned: board package, commitment letters, financing, closing date. It's all tied to that moment when I get that fully executed contract.
Yep, that's great. So there's a lot of work that goes in to a deal that happens behind the scenes where we're both communicating and working hard to make sure that you've got the information that you need to do your job. Ira, I want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Join us next time and we'll be talking about the details of a New York City contract. Thanks for joining us, everybody. If you have any questions, our contact information is below, and we'll see you next time.
And my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ira.